Back in May of 2019, I made a video called Show Me the Money, the Patrice O'Neal Documentary Indiegogo Scam. The video was about the turbulent production history of Better Than You, a documentary project started by Patrice O'Neal's widow, Vonda Carlo, and crowdfunded through Indiegogo. Towards the end of that video, I mentioned a post left on the Indiegogo page by one of the documentary's producers, Sanson Fibri, stating that the finishing and distribution of the documentary had been handed over to Comedy Central. After quite some time and numerous attempts to reconcile differences, Mark, Jason, and Sanson, collectively 3/4 of the producing team, had to part ways with Vonda Carlo, and to hand the finishing and distributing of the film to Comedy Central. Please believe us when we say we did everything, absolutely everything in our power to see this film to fruition in the former construct, but it was a dead end. It was this, or see all the work, made only because of your generous contributions, go down the drain, and never see the light of day, and that was too big a sacrifice. This came after several years of stalled production, questions about the budget of the film, and the producers essentially ghosting the people who donated to the Indiegogo campaign. Personally, I had my doubts that the documentary would ever be made, and if it was, I was skeptical about how Comedy Central would handle the project. But, lo and behold, over 2 years after the announcement on the Better Than You Indiegogo page, Comedy Central released Patrice O'Neal, Killing Is Easy, a 90-minute retrospective on Patrice O'Neal's life and comedy career. Just so I can wrap up the whole story on my end, I decided to watch Killing Is Easy and give my thoughts on it. Spoilers. It was kind of mediocre. Killing Is Easy isn't bad. I feel like I should make that point up front. I just don't know who it was made for. It's an extremely broad and basic look at Patrice's life and comedy career. If you're a fan of Patrice, you're not going to get a whole lot out of it. Better Than You was a disaster for many reasons, but there was a lot of potential behind the idea of a deep look into Patrice that was made specifically for his hardcore fans. Unfortunately, Killing Is Easy seems to barely skim the surface of who Patrice was and what he was about. We get a cursory history of his youth and early days in comedy. We hear about his experiences with racism and his philosophy on women and relationships. They discuss Tough Crowd and devote maybe 2 minutes to Opie and Anthony. It's all very brief and superficial. If you're a fan of Patrice, you probably aren't going to learn anything that you didn't already know, which is a shame in my opinion. We have hundreds of hours of Patrice speaking his mind on the radio, and you could really delve into the way he views the world if you wanted to. But they don't. Instead, they spend a few minutes on this and that and fill the rest of the time with comics talking about how brilliant and unique he was. When they talked about Patrice's views on racism in America, I don't want to say they sugarcoated it, but they definitely presented him in a way that is more palatable for today's social climate. Patrice absolutely did comment on racism and inequality in our society, but he wasn't one-dimensional. He was a racist himself, and frequently a hypocrite. That's what made the dynamic between him and other racists like Nick DiPaolo and Anthony Cumia so interesting when they would get into heated arguments on the radio. Now, maybe you don't want to outright call him a racist in the documentary, but his views were more complicated than they were presented to be in Killing Is Easy. The same could be said of the way they portrayed his philosophy on women and relationships. It was a bit sanitized. They didn't bring up shit like him abusing strippers until they cried on Opie and Anthony, and they only talked about the Black Phillip show for like 30 seconds. They also made sure to have a few female comics like Bonnie McFarlane there to give us a woman's perspective on the situation. In a documentary that repeatedly talks about how honest Patrice was, they present a fairly clean image of him. They also completely leave out one of the most important events in Patrice's life, one that undoubtedly had a huge impact on his view of women and race. I'm talking about the time he was falsely accused of rape by a white girl when he was a teenager and spent 2 months in jail. How do you leave that out of your documentary? For reasons like this, I found the documentary to be pretty underwhelming. To be entirely fair, it did exceed my expectations, but only because they were incredibly low after the debacle that was Better Than You. I was genuinely worried that Comedy Central would botch Patrice's story, but in the end it was at least serviceable, if not interesting or entertaining. However, I feel there were many missed opportunities. You could make a much more in-depth documentary about Patrice if that was your goal. As I said, they spent like 2 minutes on Opie and Anthony, and they had the Opster say a few sentences for the documentary. While I personally find it hilarious that they left Anthony out of the documentary entirely, it really glosses over a huge part of Patrice's history, Owen Day is probably as significant to his career, if not more so, than stand-up comedy in many ways. You'd be hard-pressed to find a fan of Patrice who hasn't listened to his Opie and Anthony appearances. And to this day, there are people who are still discovering Patrice through the many clips of Opie and Anthony archived on YouTube. When Vaughn was looking for support for her documentary, she went to Opie, Jim, and Anthony, and it was their fans who donated to the Indiegogo campaign. This all makes me return to what I said in the beginning. I don't know who this was made for. If you're a hardcore fan, I don't think it offers anything of substance. I'm not even a hardcore Patrice fan, but there were only a few pieces of behind-the-scenes footage and clips that I wasn't familiar with. It does an acceptable job of giving you basic information about Patrice so you're not completely lost while listening to 75 minutes of hack comics reminiscing over his memory. How you feel about that is going to vary from person to person. But I found it a bit sappy. They even had a few of Patrice's friends gather around the Comedy Cellar table to tell stories and wax poetic about his life. It's the kind of sentimental bullshit Patrice would have torn apart when he was still alive. But at least Pissy Eyes Norton didn't cry this time around. Which brings up another point I feel that I should make. These are not the same interviews filmed for Better Than You. As far as I know, the 28 interviews filmed for Better Than You were the only material they were able to produce for the documentary before handing production over to Comedy Central. With them left out of Killing Is Easy, it raises the question of whether there is any connective tissue between the two projects. It's possible that Vaughn and her cohorts sold the rights to a Patrice documentary to Comedy Central, but they decided to create their own project to avoid fulfilling the Indiegogo campaign promises. That would only be speculation on my end though, and it's hard to say how much of a hand Vaughn had in this production. On the plus side, there weren't any reenactments featuring an NFL player. On the other hand, there were a bunch of janky, cel-shaded animations that completely ruined the mood of the documentary whenever they were used. We're hearing a story about how Patrice and his friend were stopped and frisked by the cops in the wake of the Charles Stewart case, and then they cut to an animation that looks like it was from the Chip Chipperson Indiegogo cartoon. And that was one of the best looking animations in the whole documentary. Animation can work in a documentary, if they're done well and used appropriately, not when they look like something from an unaired Adult Swim pilot. I mean, I can't stress enough how bad these animations are. Does this look like Patrice to you? And is this supposed to be Bob Kelly? Bill Burr? They just feel so fucking cheap and generally don't fit the tone set by the rest of the documentary. And tone is another big issue. Is this supposed to be a lighthearted look back at his life? An exploration of the events that shaped his incisive personality? Are we supposed to solemnly appreciate his genius as described by a bunch of has-beens? The doc can't really decide whether it wants to be about his comedy career or his life. So it's a jumbled mess that jumps between different emotions and storylines without much of a structure. The end result is a generally surface-level depiction of Patrice, as told by a bunch of weepy-eyed, low-T, middle-aged comedians projecting their fears about how they will be remembered when they're dead in 20 years. At the end of the day, I question whether Patrice would even want something like this to be made. Would he approve of these lowlifes, who he mocked relentlessly, and who have only gotten worse in his absence, getting together like a bunch of old war vets to mourn him and pontificate about his brilliance? Or would he have just gone, ugh, and called them all sissies? We'll never know. Ultimately, Killing Is Easy is harmless. I wasn't enthralled by it, but it wasn't totally boring either. As surface level as a documentary was, at least they didn't completely shit all over his legacy. It won't be a total waste of your time if you choose to watch it, but don't expect to be left with any new understanding of who Patrice was, because you won't be. All in all, I'd give Killing Is Easy a 4 out of 10, for at least being competently made, but lacking in anything especially interesting, entertaining, or informative. Maybe you'll think differently. If you've seen the documentary, let me know what you thought of it in the comments. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. I just wanted to make a quick follow-up on the Patrice documentary story without getting too deep into it because there really isn't a lot to say about it. But loose ends and all that bullshit. If you liked the video and you want to support my channel, check out my Twitter and Patreon. And a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Fightback CBD, Ryan Sidor, Zelda Z, Dirtbag Thor, Erica Hughes, Milad, Dan Thomas, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, James Taylor, Kyle, Raghav Verma, CR Guitar, Mechanical Junkie, Tamby Helmick, Neem, and Kevin Howard.